When most people hear the word slavery, a single image appears in their minds. Cotton fields stretching endlessly under a brutal sun, chains, auction blocks, the American South. But that image, as horrific as it is, tells only a fraction of the story. Slavery is far older than that, far more global, far more human. Long before race was invented, before nations drew borders on maps, before the great empires we read about in history books, humans learned something that would echo through every civilization that followed. They learned how to own other humans. Slavery did not begin with Africans. It did not begin in one place or with one people. It began everywhere. Before we continue, kindly like this video and subscribe, because this episode is the beginning of a much larger story, one that spans centuries and continents. And in the episodes ahead, we'll uncover how this system evolved and reshaped the world. Act 1. Defining the institution. To understand slavery, we first need to be clear about what it actually was. Slavery is the legal ownership of one human being by another. The complete control over someone's labor, movement, and body. The right to buy them, sell them, or pass them to your children, like property. It appears in the earliest written records we have. The Code of Hammurabi, carved in stone in Babylon around 1750 BCE, contains dozens of laws about slaves, who could own them, how much they cost, what happened if you injured someone else's slave. But here's what's crucial to understand. Slavery was never one single system. It was many systems, evolving across thousands of years, across every inhabited continent, taking different forms in different places. In ancient Sumer, around 3000 BCE, a farmer who couldn't pay his debts might sell himself or his children into temporary servitude. Work off what you owed, and theoretically, you'd go free. This was debt slavery. In countless wars across history, the defeated became the property of the victors. Prisoners of war transformed into slaves with a single military defeat. This was perhaps the most common path into slavery throughout the ancient world. In Egypt, the great construction projects, the pyramids, the temples were built partly through corvée labor, a form of state-mandated service that blurred the line between citizenship and bondage. In ancient China, criminals could be enslaved as punishment. Your crime became your sentence became your identity. In the indigenous Americas, before European contact, slavery existed for ritual purposes, tribute, and labor. The Aztec Empire held slaves for various purposes. Some were prisoners taken in ritualized conflicts. Others were people who had sold themselves into slavery to pay debts. These systems had differences, yes, but they shared something fundamental. They all reduced human beings to instruments, to things, to property that could be used, traded, or discarded. But here's what these ancient systems did not share with the slavery that would come later. In the ancient world, slavery was about power, not skin color. You could be enslaved because you lost a war, because you were born in the wrong city when the army came, because you couldn't pay your debts, because you committed a crime, but not because of how you looked, not because of the color of your skin, the texture of your hair, the shape of your features. Not yet. Act 2. The Great Empires. To truly grasp the scale of ancient slavery, we need to look at the empires that perfected it. Let's start in Athens, the birthplace of democracy, the cradle of Western philosophy. Athens, where Socrates questioned everything, where Plato imagined the ideal republic, where democracy, literally rule by the people, was invented. Athens, where slaves might have outnumbered free citizens. Scholars believe that at Athens' peak, during its golden age in the 5th century BCE, slaves made up somewhere between 30 and 40% of the population. Tens of thousands of enslaved people in Athens alone. They worked as domestic servants, cleaning homes, cooking meals, raising the children of free citizens. They worked as craftsmen, pottery, metalwork, textiles. Many were skilled, and their work was highly valued. And then there were the mines. The silver mines at Laurium were death sentences. These mines funded Athens' golden age. The silver extracted there paid for the fleet that defeated the Persians. It funded the construction of the Parthenon. And it was extracted by enslaved men working in conditions of unimaginable horror. The shafts were narrow, often less than 3 feet high, forcing workers to crawl through darkness. The air was thick with dust that destroyed lungs. Many didn't survive their first year. The philosophers who gave us ethics and logic saw no contradiction. Aristotle himself owned slaves. He argued that some people were slaves by nature, born to serve, lacking the capacity for full rationality. Even the great minds that we still study today accepted slavery as natural as rain. But if Greece normalized slavery, Rome industrialized it. The Roman Empire built the largest slave system the ancient world had ever seen. As Rome conquered, it enslaved. Every military campaign brought thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, of new captives into bondage. When Julius Caesar conquered Gaul, he enslaved an estimated 1 million people. 1 million, in less than a decade of warfare. By some estimates, at the height of the empire, 1 in 3 people in Italy was enslaved. We're talking about millions of human beings. Gladiators, forced to fight and die for entertainment. Agricultural workers on vast estates called latifundia, producing grain and wine that fed the empire. Urban slaves, forming an invisible workforce that kept Rome functioning. Household slaves, who might live in relative comfort but who remained property nonetheless. Roman slavery contained multitudes. It was a system of such scale and complexity that it could encompass education and torture, intimacy and absolute brutality, all at once. But here's something crucial about Roman slavery, something that makes it fundamentally different from what would come later. Slaves could be freed. The practice was called manumission, and it was common enough that laws had to be passed to limit it. And once freed, a former slave could become a Roman citizen. Their children would be fully Roman, with no legal distinction from anyone else. Some freedmen became wealthy, successful, powerful. They intermarried with old Roman families. They had their names inscribed on monuments. Your status could change. You were enslaved not because of who you were innately, but because of what had happened to you. War, debt, misfortune. And with luck, or cunning, or the favor of your master, that status could change again. Slavery was brutal. It was dehumanizing. It destroyed millions of lives. But it was not yet permanent, not yet hereditary for all time, not yet determined by the color of your skin, not yet. Act 3, the fluidity of bondage. Here's the paradox of ancient slavery that's hardest for modern minds to grasp. The same person could be slave, then free, then slave again, or free, then slave, then freed again, then their children fully free. You could be born free, lose everything in war, spend years as a slave, earn or buy your freedom, and die a citizen. Your son could be a soldier. Your grandson could forget your family was ever enslaved at all. In the Islamic world of the Middle Ages, manumission, the freeing of slaves, was considered a pious act. It could atone for sins. The Quran encouraged it. Former slaves could become full members of Muslim society. They could marry free Muslims. They could own property. They could prosper. In fact, one of the most remarkable phenomena in Islamic history was the Mamluks literally owned in Arabic. They were military slaves, usually captured as boys, trained as elite warriors, and eventually they became rulers. Former slaves founded dynasties. They commanded armies. Imagine that. A system where slaves could become kings. Now, to be clear, none of this makes ancient slavery acceptable. These systems were still built on violence, exploitation, and the denial of fundamental human dignity. But the structure of these systems, the very logic of them, was different. There was a door out of slavery. It might be locked. It might be almost impossible to reach, but it existed. And critically, your children were not automatically born to the same fate. A Roman freedman's son could grow up alongside the son of a senator. Within a generation or two, the stain of slavery could fade. Slavery was brutal, but it was not yet permanent, inheritable, or racial. That was about to change. Act 4. The first global networks. Long before European ships ever touched the coast of West Africa, slavery was already a global business. For more than 1,000 years, caravans crossed the Sahara Desert, carrying gold northward from the kingdoms of West Africa and salt and luxury goods southward. And they carried people. The trans-Saharan slave trade moved millions of Africans, mostly from sub-Saharan West Africa, northward into North Africa and the Islamic world. They became domestic servants, concubines, soldiers, agricultural workers. This trade existed for centuries. Over the entire span, roughly from the 7th century CE to the early 20th century, it's estimated that somewhere between 6 and 9 million enslaved Africans were transported northward. On the East African coast, a different network flourished. The Indian Ocean slave trade connected East Africa with Arabia, Persia, India, and even China. For centuries, ships called dhows rode the monsoon winds across the Indian Ocean. Enslaved Africans from the East African coast were transported to the Arabian Peninsula, Persia, and beyond. Here's what's crucial to understand. Africa was not isolated. African kingdoms were players in these systems. African rulers and merchants sold war captives and criminals into these networks. This is an uncomfortable fact, but it's a fact. African participation in the slave trade before European contact was real, but the system they were participating in was not racial slavery. It was not based on an ideology that said Africans as a people were inferior and suited only for bondage. When an African ruler sold prisoners of war, he was participating in a practice that was common worldwide. Slavery was about power, about conquest, about economics, not about race. And crucially, the children of slaves were not automatically enslaved. The status was not necessarily permanent or inheritable. When European traders arrived on the West African coast in the 15th century, they entered a world that already knew slavery. But what they would build was something different, something unprecedented. Act 5. The moment everything changed. The 15th century was a hinge point in human history. Portuguese explorers, seeking a route to the wealth of Asia, began to navigate the coast of Africa. They established trading posts. They made contact with African kingdoms, and they began to buy slaves. At first, it was small scale, a few hundred people a year. The Portuguese were simply plugging into the existing trade networks. But then, something changed the equation entirely. Sugar. European colonizers realized that the climate of the Caribbean islands and parts of South America was perfect for growing sugarcane on a massive scale. And there was potentially unlimited demand for sugar in Europe. The problem was labor. Sugarcane cultivation is one of the most labor-intensive agricultural processes ever devised. The work is backbreaking. The conditions are brutal. Sugar plantations devoured labor. They consumed human bodies at an appalling rate. The indigenous populations of the Caribbean were the first victims. European diseases killed them in vast numbers. European violence killed them. The plantation system killed them. The indigenous population of Hispaniola went from an estimated 400,000 people in 1492 to a few thousand by 1550. The colonizers needed workers, millions of them, people who could be forced to work under conditions that would kill them and replaced when they died. And so they turned to Africa. What started as a trickle became a flood. Over the next 4 centuries, approximately 12.5 million Africans would be forcibly transported across the Atlantic. 12.5 million human beings, captured, chained, marched to the coast, crammed into ships, sold in New World markets. The Middle Passage, the journey across the Atlantic, killed roughly 1.8 million people. The conditions were so horrific, they defy adequate description. People chained in spaces too small to sit up. Disease rampant. Food and water scarce. Those who survived faced a nightmare that would last generations. Because here's what made this new system different from everything that came before. Over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries, European colonies created legal codes that defined slavery in a new way. In Virginia, a law passed in 1662 stated that if your mother was a slave, you were a slave, forever, regardless of who your father was. In 1667, Virginia declared that baptism and conversion to Christianity did not alter enslaved status. In 1691, Virginia banned interracial marriage. These legal codes spread throughout the colonies. By the 18th century, the laws made it clear: black skin meant slavery, white skin meant freedom. This was the innovation of New World slavery. It wasn't about what you did or what happened to you. It was about what you were, about your skin color, and it was permanent, forever, no way out. If your mother was a slave, you were a slave. Your children would be slaves. Your grandchildren would be slaves. Your great-great-great-grandchildren would be slaves. This had never existed before. Not on this scale, not with this absolute finality. And to justify this unprecedented system, Europeans invented an unprecedented ideology. They invented the concept of biological race. Before the Atlantic slave trade, differences between peoples were understood primarily in terms of culture, religion, and geography. But racial ideology said something different. It said that humans are divided into races with innate biological differences that determine their capabilities and their place in the world. In the racial ideology developed to justify slavery, black people were said to be naturally inferior, intellectually inferior, morally inferior, physically suited for labor. This was pseudoscience. It was lies. Modern genetics has proven beyond any doubt that there is no biological basis for race. The genetic variation within any so-called racial group is greater than the variation between groups. But it didn't matter that it was false. It mattered that it was useful. The ideology of race justified the unjustifiable. It made the unthinkable seem natural. It allowed people who considered themselves civilized to participate in a system of cruelty that would have shocked their ancestors. A Roman slave owner didn't need to believe his slaves were fundamentally different kinds of humans. They were just people who had lost in war. But an American plantation owner needed a different justification, because slavery contradicted the emerging ideology of the Enlightenment, the idea that all men are created equal. So how do you maintain slavery in a society that claims to believe in liberty and equality? They argue that the enslaved aren't really men in the full sense, that they're a different category of human. They invent race. And this ideology, once invented, proved remarkably persistent. It outlived slavery itself. When slavery was finally abolished, the racial ideology that had been created to justify it didn't disappear. It evolved. It became segregation, Jim Crow laws, lynching, colonialism, immigration restrictions, eugenics. 1,000 forms of discrimination that persist to this day. This was not ancient slavery. This was something new, and it would reshape the world. Act 6, why this matters. So why does it matter that we understand ancient slavery? Because history isn't a series of isolated events. It's a continuum. The past shapes the present. The ancient idea that some people are naturally suited to serve didn't originate with the Atlantic slave trade. It's as old as civilization itself. When European colonizers needed to justify racial slavery, they reached back to these old ideas. The legal frameworks that made human beings into property weren't invented in the 16th century. They were adapted from Roman law, from medieval legal codes. The economic motivation, free labor, maximum profit, that's the same calculation whether you're a Roman senator or a Caribbean plantation owner. So the systems of the ancient world didn't disappear, they evolved. But here's the crucial difference. Ancient slavery systems, for all their brutality, had cracks, possibilities, ways out, however narrow. Racial slavery sealed those cracks. It made slavery hereditary for all time. It tied bondage to identity in a way that had never been done before. And even when formal slavery ended, the ideas that were invented to justify it didn't die. After the Civil War, the United States didn't become a society of racial equality. We got black codes, convict leasing, sharecropping, Jim Crow, segregation, lynching, redlining, the war on drugs. All of this grew out of the ideology that was invented to justify slavery. And this isn't just American history. European colonialism in Africa and Asia was justified using the same racial ideology. Apartheid in South Africa, immigration restrictions, eugenics movements. The world we live in today was shaped by these systems. The global distribution of wealth and poverty, the persistent inequalities that divide societies, these aren't accidents. They're the legacy of slavery. Understanding this history doesn't mean wallowing in guilt. It means seeing clearly. It means recognizing that the inequalities we see aren't natural or inevitable. They were created. And what was created can be dismantled. But we can't dismantle systems we don't understand. Slavery did not begin with Africans. It began with humanity itself, with our capacity for domination, for exploitation. But racial slavery, the kind that said your humanity was determined by your skin, that you and all your descendants were property forever, that was invented, and understanding that invention is essential to understanding the world we live in. In the next episode, we follow the trade routes that turned Africa into the center of the largest forced migration in human history. We'll explore how the Atlantic slave trade actually worked, the African kingdoms that participated, and the European powers that drove it, the economics that transformed the world, and the resistance that never stopped. This is a story that needs to be told completely, honestly, without flinching from the horror. Slavery did not begin with race. For thousands of years, humans enslaved other humans. It was terrible. It was cruel. It destroyed millions of lives. But it was not yet about race. It was not yet permanent. Then, in the 15th and 16th centuries, something changed. European colonizers created a new kind of slavery. One that was hereditary, one that was permanent, one that was based on skin color. And to justify this unprecedented system, they invented an unprecedented lie. They invented the idea of biological race. This was always a lie. But it was a useful lie. It justified the unjustifiable. And when slavery finally ended, that lie didn't die. It evolved. It adapted. It became segregation, colonialism, the foundation for systems of inequality that persist to this day. Race was invented to protect slavery, and that invention may be slavery's most enduring legacy. But what was invented can be dismantled.